Picture this. You've spent 8 years building your reputation, exceeding every target, turning around failing departments, and proving yourself worthy of the executive suite. Then, on the day of your biggest promotion, you're told you're too emotional to lead. What would you do? Would you accept defeat? Or would you show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who knows her worth? I'm Rachel Martinez, and this is the story of how I turned the boardroom's biggest mistake into their most expensive lesson. What you're about to hear isn't just about corporate politics or workplace betrayal. It's about what happens when you push someone too far and they decide to push back with everything they've got. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the massive windows of Meridian Financial's 32nd floor, casting long shadows across my office as I stood there holding what should have been the best news of my career. Instead, the email in my hands felt like a death sentence wrapped in corporate speak. We regret to inform you that the position of Chief Operating Officer has been awarded to another candidate who better aligns with our leadership philosophy. 8 years of 15-hour days, of missing family dinners and weekend trips, of being the first person in the building every morning and the last to leave every night. 8 years of turning around 3 failing departments, of bringing in over $40 million in new revenue, of mentoring junior staff and building the kind of team loyalty that other executives could only dream of. And it all came down to this sterile rejection letter that didn't even have the courage to use my name. I was Rachel Martinez, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Meridian Financial, and according to the rumor mill that had been buzzing for weeks, I was supposed to be a shoo-in for the COO position. My performance reviews were flawless, my client retention rate was the highest in the company, and I had successfully led the integration of our merger with Pacific Holdings 2 years ago. On paper, I was everything they said they wanted in their next executive leader. But paper doesn't tell the whole story, does it? Paper doesn't capture the way certain board members' expressions changed when I spoke passionately about employee development or client advocacy. Paper doesn't document the subtle eye rolls when I pushed back against budget cuts that would hurt our teams, or the way conversations seemed to shift when I walked into a room. Paper doesn't reveal that being a woman who cares deeply about her work isn't seen as an asset, but as a liability. The notification sound on my phone broke through my thoughts. A text from my closest ally in the company, Thomas Rivera, the Senior Director of Operations, who had become both my mentor and my friend over the years. Conference room B in 5 minutes. We need to talk. The tone was urgent, which meant he'd heard something, and knowing Thomas, it wasn't going to be good news. I straightened my blazer, took one last look at the Seattle skyline that I'd grown to love from this office, and walked toward what I somehow knew would be a conversation that changed everything. Thomas was already waiting when I arrived, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something I'd rarely seen from him. Anger. "Close the door, Rachel," he said without preamble. Thomas was in his 50s, a seasoned executive who had navigated corporate politics longer than I'd been alive, and he had a reputation for being unflappable. Seeing him this agitated sent a chill down my spine. I settled into the chair across from him, noting the way his hands were clasped tightly on the table. "I'm guessing you heard about the COO decision." I heard more than that. His voice was low, controlled, but there was steel underneath. "I just came from an informal board discussion that I wasn't supposed to be part of. Rachel, they didn't just pass you over, they actively campaigned against you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd prepared myself for disappointment, had even considered the possibility that politics might play a role in the decision. But active opposition? That was something else entirely. "What do you mean, campaigned against me?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Thomas leaned forward, his expression grim. "Margaret Chen called a private meeting with key board members last week. She's been building a case that you're not ready for executive leadership, that your management style is too." Margaret Chen, the board chair who had been with Meridian for over a decade, who had always seemed supportive of my career advancement, who had personally recommended me for the strategic development role 3 years ago. Hearing her name in this context felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than the rejection itself. "Emotional," I repeated. the word tasting bitter in my mouth. And I suppose they found someone less emotional to fill the role. Bradley Walsh from our Denver office. He's being positioned as the steady, rational choice, someone who can make tough decisions without getting personally invested. Thomas's jaw tightened as he spoke. Never mind that Bradley has never managed a team larger than 20 people, or that his last major project came in 6 months late and 40% over budget. I felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with being held to a different standard than my male colleagues. Bradley Walsh. I knew him peripherally from company conferences and video calls. He was competent enough, certainly not incompetent, but his track record was nowhere near mine. The only advantage he had was that he fit the traditional mold of what people expected a corporate executive to look like: tall, white, male, and blessed with the kind of natural authority that society handed out to men like him at birth. "There's more, isn't there?" I said, reading the expression on Thomas's face. He nodded slowly. "Margaret isn't just concerned about your emotional management style. She's planning a complete restructuring of the senior executive team. She wants a COO who will support her vision for streamlining operations, which apparently includes eliminating several VP positions that she considers redundant." My blood ran cold. "Which positions? Yours is one of them." Also Elena Rodriguez from Human Resources, and David Kim from Client Relations. Basically anyone who might push back against her plans. Thomas's voice dropped even lower. "Rachel, she's not just blocking your promotion, she's planning to force you out entirely." The room seemed to spin around me. This wasn't just about losing a promotion anymore. This was about losing everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for. Margaret Chen wasn't just passing me over for advancement. She was systematically removing anyone who might challenge her authority or question her decision. "How long do I have?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Bradley starts in 2 weeks. The restructuring announcement will come about a month after that, once he's settled in and can be positioned as the one making the difficult decisions." Thomas studied my face carefully. "Rachel, I've been watching corporate politics for 25 years, and I've never seen anything this calculated. She's not just making business decisions, she's eliminating threats." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over both of us. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent in this building, all the weekends I'd given up to ensure projects were completed perfectly. I thought about the team I'd built, the people who trusted me, the clients who specifically requested to work with me, because they knew I'd fight for their interests. But then something else crept into my thought, something that had been building slowly over the years of watching less qualified men get promoted ahead of women, of being told to be more assertive, but then criticized for being too aggressive, of having my passion for the work labeled as emotional instability. It started as a small flame of anger, but as I sat there processing what Thomas had told me, it grew into something much more dangerous. "Thomas," I said finally, my voice taking on a tone he'd never heard from me before, "what if I told you I wasn't planning to make this easy for them?" He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, feeling something shift inside me. For 8 years I'd played by their rules. I'd been professional when I wanted to be furious, diplomatic when I wanted to be direct, and accommodating when I should have been demanding. I'd let them define the terms of engagement, had accepted their framework for what made a good leader, had internalized their criticism, and tried to mold myself into their vision of acceptable female ambition. But Margaret Chen had just made a critical error. She had underestimated me. She thought that by labeling me as too emotional, she could dismiss me as weak or unpredictable. She had no idea that my emotions weren't a weakness, they were fuel, and she had just given me enough fuel to burn down everything she'd built. I said, meeting Thomas's eyes with a smile that probably looked dangerous, that Margaret Chen has been playing corporate politics for a long time, but she's never played them against someone who has nothing left to lose. Thomas blinked, then slowly smiled back. "Rachel, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Margaret believes she's been very clever, putting all the pieces in place for her perfect restructuring plan. She thinks she's found the ideal puppet in Bradley, someone who'll do exactly what she wants without question." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "But here's what she doesn't know. Bradley Walsh has no idea what he's walking into. He thinks he's getting a promotion to CEO of a successful company. He has no clue that Margaret is planning to use him to destroy careers and then discard him when he's no longer useful. And, Thomas prompted, I turned back to face him. And Margaret Chen is about to learn what happens when you try to destroy someone who knows all your weaknesses, has access to all your mistakes, and has absolutely nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Thomas was studying my face, and I could see him mentally running through scenarios, calculating risks and potential outcomes. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. You're talking about something that could backfire spectacularly, he said. If you go after Margaret directly and it doesn't work, you'll be finished in this industry. I'm already finished in this industry, if I do nothing, I replied. At least this way, I go down fighting. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to smile. It was the expression I'd seen on his face when he was working through a particularly complex strategic problem, the look of someone who was beginning to see all the moving pieces of a complicated puzzle. You know what your biggest advantage is in this situation? He asked. Tell me. Margaret thinks she's already won. She's so confident in her plan that she's not watching for counterattacks, and Bradley is going to be so focused on proving himself in his new role that he won't see the trap she's setting for him until it's too late. Thomas leaned forward. Rachel, if we play this right, we can turn Margaret's own strategy against her. The word we sent a surge of gratitude through me. I'd been prepared to fight this battle alone, but having Thomas on my side changed everything. He had institutional knowledge, relationships throughout the company, and most importantly, he understood how to navigate the complex web of corporate alliances and rivalries that determined who succeeded and who failed at Meridian. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking that Margaret Chen is about to make the biggest mistake of her career. She's so focused on eliminating you as a threat that she's not paying attention to all the other people who might be watching her moves. Elena and David don't know their targets yet, but they will soon. When they find out, they're not going to take it quietly. I nodded slowly, beginning to see where he was going with this. You think they'll fight back? I think they'll be very interested in working with someone who can help them protect their position, especially if that someone has a plan that doesn't just save their jobs, but also ensures that the person trying to destroy them faces consequences for her actions. We spent the next hour mapping out what Thomas called the long game. It wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be simple, but by the time we were finished, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Margaret Chen thought she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. What she didn't realize was that she had just declared war on someone who was playing an entirely different game. And in this game, the person who appeared to lose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Who's first was often the one who won in the end. As I walked back to my office that afternoon, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about fitting into their expectations, or proving that I belonged in their boys' club. I wasn't concerned about being seen as too aggressive or too emotional, or too ambitious. Margaret Chen had called me too emotional to lead. She was about to discover that she was absolutely right. I was passionate about justice, furious about inequality, and completely committed to making sure that people who abused their power faced the consequences of their actions. But what Margaret didn't understand was that emotion, when channeled properly, wasn't a weakness. It was the most powerful force in the world, and she had just given me 8 years' worth of suppressed emotion to work with. Bradley Walsh would be starting his new position in 2 weeks, walking into a situation he couldn't possibly understand. Margaret Chen would be implementing her restructuring plan, confident that she had eliminated all potential opposition, and me, I would be doing exactly what they expected, appearing to accept my fate while quietly planning my exit. What none of them would see coming was that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in my career, I was playing by my own rules. The weekend passed in a blur of research and reconnaissance. While most people were enjoying their Saturday morning coffee and leisurely brunches, I was in my home office, surrounded by financial reports, organizational charts, and personnel files that I'd been accumulating for years. Thomas had been right about one thing. Margaret Chen's plan was methodical and calculated, but it also left traces for anyone who knew where to look. What I discovered during those 2 days of digging made my blood run cold and my resolve burn even hotter. This wasn't just about eliminating me or a few other perceived threats. Margaret had been systematically positioning herself for a complete takeover of Meridian Financial's operational structure, and Bradley Walsh was just the latest piece in a puzzle she'd been assembling for over 2 years. I found the pattern buried in board meeting minutes and budget allocation reports. Every executive who had questioned Margaret's strategic direction over the past 18 months had either been transferred to less influential positions, encouraged to take early retirement package, or simply found their departmental budgets cut to the point where they couldn't function effectively. She hadn't been making random power moves. She'd been conducting a slow-motion corporate coup, and now she was ready for the final phase. The truly infuriating part was how clever she'd been about it. Each individual action looked reasonable on its surface. A budget adjustment here, a reorganization there, a promotion that happened to move someone away from a position of influence. But when you stepped back and looked at the whole picture, the pattern was unmistakable. Margaret Chen had been playing a game that the rest of us didn't even know existed. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena Rodriguez, the VP of Human Resources, who Thomas had mentioned as another target. "Can we talk? Something strange is happening with next quarter's staffing projections." The message was followed by another one, not over company channels, coffee somewhere off-site. I stared at the message for a long moment. Elena and I had worked together on several major projects over the years, but we weren't particularly close. If she was reaching out about staffing irregularities and specifically requesting a meeting away from the office, it meant she'd noticed something that worried her. It also meant that Margaret's plan was already in motion, and the people she intended to eliminate were starting to sense that something was wrong. I texted back quickly, "Absolutely. How about that little place on Pine Street, 1 hour?" Elena's response was immediate, "See you there." The cafe on Pine Street was one of those independent coffee shops that somehow managed to survive despite being wedged between 2 Starbucks locations. It was the kind of place where you could have a conversation without worrying about running into colleagues or being overheard by the wrong people. Elena was already waiting when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her laptop closed, and a worried expression that she couldn't quite hide behind her professional smile. "Rachel, thank you for meeting me on such short notice." Elena Rodriguez was in her early 40s, a consummate HR professional, who had built her reputation on being able to navigate the most complex personnel situations with diplomacy and discretion. Seeing her this visibly unsettled was unsettling in itself. I slid into the booth across from her and ordered a coffee from the server, who appeared almost immediately. "Of course, you said something about staffing projections." Elena glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward and lowered her voice. "I've been reviewing the preliminary budget numbers for next quarter, and there are some allocations that don't make sense. Specifically, there are termination packages being budgeted for positions that aren't scheduled for elimination." My heart rate picked up, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of positions?" "Senior VP level and above. The numbers suggest they're planning to eliminate at least 3, possibly 4 executive positions over the next 6 months. Elena's fingers drummed nervously against her coffee cup. "But here's the strange part. There's been no discussion of these eliminations in any of the executive committee meetings I've attended. No strategic review of departmental redundancies, no performance evaluations that would justify these kinds of moves." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Margaret was moving faster than Thomas had anticipated. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" "That's just it. I tried to bring it up with Margaret during our quarterly review meeting on Friday, thinking maybe I'd missed some communications about restructuring plans." Elena's expression darkened. "She told me that strategic planning was above my pay grade, and that I should focus on operational HR issues rather than corporate strategy." The dismissive response was so typically Margaret that I almost smiled. She had a talent for making people feel small when they asked inconvenient questions, a skill she'd honed over years of climbing the corporate ladder. But what she probably didn't realize was that Elena Rodriguez was not someone who accepted being dismissed lightly, especially when it came to matters that fell squarely within her professional expertise. Above your pay grade, I repeat. That's interesting feedback for a VP who's responsible for managing executive compensation and benefits. Exactly. Elena's voice carried an edge of anger that I'd never heard from her before. Rachel, I've been in HR for 15 years, and I've managed executive transitions at 3 different companies. I know what normal restructuring looks like, and this isn't it. This feels like something else entirely. I took a sip of my coffee, buying myself a moment to think. Elena had come to me with information that confirmed everything Thomas and I had suspected, but she didn't know that I was one of the targets. This was a delicate moment. I could share what I knew and potentially gain a valuable ally, or I could play it safe and gather more information before revealing my hand. The decision was made for me when Elena continued speaking. There's something else. I think one of the positions being eliminated might be yours. I set my coffee cup down carefully. What makes you say that? The budget allocation for your department shows a significant reduction in administrative support and discretionary spending starting next quarter. Those are usually the first cuts they make before eliminating a position entirely. Elena met my eyes directly, plus I heard through the grapevine that you were passed over for the COO position. Sometimes when someone doesn't get a promotion they were expecting, companies start looking for ways to manage the situation. There it was. Elena knew, or at least suspected, that I was being pushed out. The question now was whether she was approaching me as a potential ally, or as someone trying to protect her own position by gathering intelligence. I decided to test the waters. Elena, can I ask you something direct? Do you think these eliminations are justified from a business perspective? She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. Honestly, no. The departments being targeted are some of our strongest performers. If I were making decisions based purely on metrics and efficiency, these wouldn't be the positions I'd eliminate. She paused, but that's assuming the decisions are being made based on business metrics. What else would they be based on? Elena's expression hardened. Politics, control. Someone deciding that they want a leadership team that won't question their decisions or challenge their authority. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Elena had reached the same conclusions that Thomas and I had, which meant she was intelligent enough to be a valuable ally, and angry enough to be motivated to fight back. The question was how far she was willing to go. Hypothetically, I said carefully, if someone wanted to protect themselves and their colleagues from this kind of political maneuvering, what would you recommend? Elena smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. Hypothetically, I'd recommend that someone start documenting everything: personnel decisions, budget allocations, policy changes, communication patterns. Create a paper trail that shows the real motivations behind these moves. And then I'd recommend that someone make sure the right people see that documentation. Board members who aren't part of the inner circle, shareholders who care about company performance, regulatory bodies that monitor corporate governance. Elena leaned back in her chair. Hypothetically speaking, of course. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us understanding that we'd just crossed a line from concerned employees to potential conspirators. It was a line that once crossed, would be very difficult to step back over. Elena, I said finally, I need to tell you something. The position being eliminated isn't just mine, it's also yours, and David Kim's. Her face went pale. How do you know that? I told her about my conversation with Thomas, about Margaret's plan to restructure the executive team, about Bradley Walsh being brought in as a controllable COO who would implement the changes without question. I watched Elena's expression shift from shock to anger to something that looked very much like the feeling I'd been carrying around for the past few days, a cold, calculating fury. So we're all targets, she said when I finished. Yeah, but Elena, we're also all people who know where the bodies are buried. Margaret may think she's being clever, but she's also making enemies of people who have access to a lot of very sensitive information about how this company really operates. Elena nodded slowly. You're talking about fighting back. I'm talking about making sure that if Margaret Chen wants to destroy our careers, she's going to pay a very high price for it. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. This wasn't the pause of people figuring out what they wanted to say, this was the silence of people making a decision that would change everything. What do you need from me? Elena asked. The next few days were a masterclass in maintaining professional composure while your world crumbled around you. I showed up to work each morning with the same confident smile I'd worn for 8 years, attended the same meetings, filed the same reports, and made the same small talk in the elevator. To anyone watching, I was the picture of a senior executive handling disappointment with grace and professionalism. What they couldn't see was the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. 8 years of suppressed frustration, of swallowed comebacks, of diplomatic responses to condescending comments, of playing the game by rules that were designed to keep people like me from winning. It was all there, just waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to my team about what was happening, because that would only create panic and potentially compromise their own position. I couldn't discuss it with other executives because I didn't know who might be allied with Margaret or who might use the information against me. Even my conversations with Thomas had to be carefully managed to avoid suspicion. But isolation, I was learning, could also be a form of preparation. Without the distractions of normal corporate socializing, I was able to focus entirely on understanding the true scope of what I was facing. And what I discovered during those long, quiet hours in my office was that Margaret Chen's plan was even more comprehensive than I'd initially realized. She hadn't just been targeting individual executives, she'd been systematically undermining the entire culture that had made Meridian Financial successful. The collaborative leadership style that had driven our growth over the past decade was being replaced by a top-down authoritarian structure that would concentrate power in Margaret's hands, while eliminating anyone who might challenge her decision. The evidence was everywhere once I knew how to look for it. Policy changes that required senior executive approval for decisions that had previously been made at the departmental level. Budget procedures that routed all significant expenditures through Margaret's office. Communication protocols that required her to be copied on email exchanges between VP-level staff and their teams. She was building a corporate dictatorship, and she was using the COO transition as cover for the final phase of her takeover. But understanding Margaret's strategy also revealed its weaknesses. She was so focused on consolidating power that she wasn't paying attention to the resentment she was creating among the people she needed to implement her vision. She assumed that fear of job loss would keep everyone in line, but she had badly miscalculated the psychology of high-performing executives who had built their careers on competence and autonomy. The breakthrough came on Thursday afternoon when David Kim, the VP of Client Relations, knocked on my office door. David was one of our most diplomatic executives, a man who could smooth over the most difficult client situations, and somehow make everyone feel like they'd gotten exactly what they wanted. If David was seeking out a private conversation, it meant something significant was happening. "Rachel, do you have a few minutes?" His usual calm demeanor was intact, but I could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. I gestured to the chairs in front of my desk. "Of course, what's on your mind?" David closed the door behind him and took a seat. "I've been hearing some interesting things about organizational changes that might be coming down the pipeline. I was wondering if you'd heard anything similar." It was a carefully worded question that gave both of us plausible deniability if this conversation went in a direction either of us wasn't comfortable with. I appreciated the diplomatic approach, but I was also beginning to realize that diplomacy might not be enough to handle what we were facing. "I've heard some rumors," I said carefully. "What specifically have you been hearing?" "Budget adjustments that suggest staff reductions in senior positions, client account reassignments that don't make strategic sense, communication changes that seem designed to limit information flow rather than improve efficiency." David's voice remained steady, but his words carried weight. Independently, any of these might be explained by normal business evolution. Together, they suggest something more systematic. I nodded. David had drawn the same conclusions that Alina and I had reached, which confirmed that Margaret's plan was becoming visible to anyone who was paying attention. The question was whether David was prepared to do something about it, or whether he was simply trying to position himself to survive whatever was coming. "David, can I ask you something directly? If you suspected that these changes were politically motivated rather than business-driven, what would you want to do about it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. David Kim had built his career on being the person who could find middle ground in any conflict, who could build bridges between opposing viewpoints, who could negotiate solutions that satisfied everyone involved. What I was essentially asking him was whether he was prepared to abandon that approach and engage in corporate warfare. Rachel, I've been with this company for 12 years. I've seen a lot of leadership transitions, and I've always believed that the best approach was to adapt to new management styles and find ways to work within whatever system emerged. He paused, then looked directly at me. But I've never seen anything like what's happening now. This isn't about leadership style or strategic vision. This is about someone systematically eliminating anyone who might question their authority. And I don't think adaptation is going to be enough this time. I think some of us are going to have to make a choice between fighting back and accepting that our careers at Meridian are over. There it was. David Kim, the ultimate diplomatic professional, was ready to go to war. If Margaret had pushed someone like David to the point where he was considering active resistance, she had badly miscalculated the impact of her strategy. What would fighting back look like to you? I asked. David smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it wasn't a diplomatic smile designed to put someone at ease. It was the smile of someone who had just decided to stop playing defense and start playing offense. It would look like making sure that the board members who aren't part of Margaret's inner circle understand exactly what kind of leader they're empowering. It would look like documenting every questionable decision, every ethical shortcut, every instance where personal politics took precedence over business judgment. His voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it. And it would look like making sure that if Margaret Chen wants to destroy our careers, she has to do it in full view of everyone who matters. I felt a surge of excitement that I had to work to suppress. With Elena's HR expertise, David's client relationships, and Thomas's institutional knowledge, we weren't just talking about three isolated executives trying to save their own position. We were talking about a coordinated response that could expose everything Margaret had been doing and potentially save the company from her authoritarian takeover. David, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this, but not here, and not alone. He nodded. I was hoping you'd say that, because I think Elena Rodriguez and I had a very similar conversation yesterday, and I think Thomas Rivera might be interested in joining us as well. The pieces were falling into place faster than I had dared to hope. Margaret's targets were finding each other, and we were all reaching the same conclusion. If we were going down, we were going to take her with us. But as I sat there looking at David's determined expression, I realized that we had moved beyond just trying to save our own career. Margaret Chen had made a fundamental error in her calculations. She had assumed that successful executives would prioritize their own survival over principles or loyalty to the company. She had failed to consider that the very qualities that had made us successful, integrity, strategic thinking, and commitment to excellence, were the same qualities that would make us dangerous opponents. She wanted to eliminate us because we were threats to her authority. What she was about to discover was that we were much bigger threats when we were working together than we had ever been individually. The secret meeting took place the following Saturday morning, at Thomas's house in the Bellevue suburb. It was the kind of gathering that, under normal circumstances, might have been a pleasant social occasion among colleagues who had become friends over the years. Instead, it felt like a war council convening to plan a counteroffensive against an enemy who had severely underestimated their opposition. Thomas's living room had been transformed into a makeshift command center. He'd cleared the coffee table and arranged chairs in a circle, creating an environment that encouraged collaboration while maintaining the privacy we needed for what we were about to discuss. Elena arrived first, carrying a laptop bag and a folder thick with documents. David followed 10 minutes later with his own collection of files and a grim expression that suggested he'd spent the week discovering things he wished he hadn't. I was the last to arrive, deliberately timing my entrance to give the others a chance to settle in and begin processing what we were really doing. Walking into that room felt like crossing a point of no return. Once we started sharing information and coordinating our response, we would be committed to a course of action that could either save our careers or destroy them completely. Before we begin, Thomas said once everyone was seated, I want to make sure we're all clear about what we're discussing here. We're not just talking about protecting ourselves from Margaret's restructuring plan. We're talking about actively working to expose her methods and potentially remove her from her position of authority. Elena nodded. I've been thinking about this all week, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Margaret isn't just targeting us because we're inconvenient. She's targeting us because we represent a different model of leadership than what she wants to implement. If we let her eliminate us without a fight, we're not just losing our jobs, we're allowing the company culture to be fundamentally changed in ways that will hurt everyone who works here. David opened his folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. I've been documenting the client account reassignments that have happened over the past 6 months. What I've found is a pattern of moving our most valuable relationships away from senior executives who have strong client loyalty and toward newer staff members who don't have established relationships. I leaned forward to examine the document. She's breaking up the power bases that could challenge her authority. Exactly, and here's the really concerning part. David pulled out a spreadsheet with client names and revenue figures. The reassignments aren't being made based on performance metrics or strategic logic. They're being made based on who Margaret trusts to follow orders without asking questions. Thomas studied the spreadsheet. This is incredibly risky from a business perspective. Some of these client relationships took years to build. If the transitions don't go smoothly, we could lose millions in revenue, which brings us to the central question. Elena said, is Margaret making these decisions because she genuinely believes they're in the company's best interests? Or is she so focused on consolidating power that she's willing to jeopardize the business to achieve her goal? I had been thinking about this exact question for days, and I'd reached a conclusion that both frightened and energized me. I think Margaret has convinced herself that what's good for her control is automatically good for the company. She's not evil or incompetent. She's just so committed to her vision of how things should work that she can't see the damage she's causing, which makes her more dangerous than someone who's purely self-interested. Thomas observed, people who believe they're saving the company from itself can justify almost anything. Elena opened her laptop and turned the screen so everyone could see it. I've been analyzing the personnel data from Margaret's previous positions before she joined Meridian. There's a pattern. At every company where she's held senior leadership roles, there were significant staff turnovers in executive positions within 18 months of her arrival. The data on the screen was damning. Company after company showed the same trend. Margaret would join as a senior executive, initially be praised for bringing stability and strategic focus, and then systematically replace existing leadership with people who shared her management philosophy. The companies didn't fail, exactly, but they became more centralized, more risk-averse and less innovative. She's done this before, David said quietly. Multiple times. Elena confirmed. And it's worked for her because she's very good at presenting the changes as necessary modernization, rather than personal empire building. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, she's consolidated enough power to make opposition very difficult. I felt a chill run down my spine. We weren't just dealing with someone making bad decisions under pressure, we were dealing with someone who had perfected a system for taking control of organizations and reshaping them according to her vision. Margaret Chen wasn't just threatening our individual career. She was following a playbook that had already been tested at multiple companies. So the question becomes, Thomas said, how do we stop someone who has successfully executed this strategy multiple times before? I had been thinking about this question all week, and I'd reached some conclusions that I wasn't sure the others were ready to hear. We stop her by using her own confidence against her. Margaret has been successful because she's been able to implement her changes gradually, without triggering organized resistance, but she's moving faster at Meridian than she has at previous companies, which means she's more vulnerable to making mistakes. What kind of mistakes? Elena asked. The kind that come from overconfidence. Margaret thinks she's eliminated all potential threats to her plan, so she's not being as careful about covering her track. She's also bringing in Bradley Walsh as COO, without properly vetting whether he'll actually be the compliant ally she expects him to be. David looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing. You think Bradley might not go along with her plan? I think Bradley has no idea what Margaret's plan actually is. He's coming in thinking he's been hired to be COO of a successful financial services company. He doesn't know that he's expected to be the public face of a systematic purge of senior leadership. I paused, making sure I had everyone's attention. What happens when Bradley realizes that his first major act as COO is going to be firing 3 well-respected executives for what appear to be political reasons? Thomas smiled slowly. He's going to start asking questions about why these decisions are necessary and whether they're in the company's best interests. And when he starts asking those questions, Elena added, he's going to need answers that Margaret can't provide without revealing her real motivation. Which means, David concluded, that if we can position ourselves properly, Margaret is going to be caught between a COO, who won't blindly follow orders, and a board that's starting to question her judgment. I nodded. Exactly. But that only works if we're strategic about how we play this. We can't just wait for Bradley to figure out what's happening and hope he makes the right decisions. We need to actively shape the situation so that when Margaret's plan starts falling apart, we're positioned to benefit from the chaos. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone processed the implications of what I was suggesting. We weren't just talking about defending ourselves anymore. We were talking about actively engineering Margaret's downfall by turning her own strategy against her. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Rachel, what you're describing is essentially a corporate counterintelligence operation. We'd be manipulating information flow, managing perceptions, and deliberately creating situations designed to expose Margaret's weaknesses. Yes, I said simply. That's exactly what I'm describing. Elena closed her laptop. The risks are enormous. If we're caught actively working against Margaret, we won't just lose our jobs, we'll be finished in this industry. And if we do nothing, David countered, we lose our jobs anyway, and Margaret gets to implement her authoritarian vision without any resistance. I looked around the room at these 3 people who had become my allies in what was shaping up to be the most important battle of my professional life. I won't ask anyone to take risks they're not comfortable with, but I need you all to understand something. Margaret Chen made a critical error when she decided to target all of us simultaneously. She assumed that we'd be too focused on our own survival to work together effectively. She was wrong, Elena said quietly. She was very wrong. And now we have an opportunity to show her what happens when you underestimate people who have spent their entire careers learning how to solve complex problems under pressure. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful suburban neighborhood that seemed so far removed from the corporate warfare we were planning. If we do this, we have to be perfect. One mistake, one miscalculation, and Margaret will destroy all of it. Then we won't make any mistakes, I said. The plan that emerged over the next 3 hours was both elegant and ruthless. It relied on Margaret's own overconfidence and her assumption that we would react predictably to the threats she was making. Instead of panicking or trying to negotiate for our positions, we would do something she wouldn't expect. We would help her implement her plan while simultaneously documenting every ethical violation and strategic error she made along the way. Thomas had christened it Operation Transparency, though I privately thought of it as giving Margaret exactly enough rope to hang herself with. The beauty of the strategy was that it required us to do nothing that could be considered insubordination or corporate sabotage. We would simply be exceptionally thorough in documenting decisions, meticulously careful about following proper procedures, and extraordinarily diligent about keeping detailed records of all our interactions with senior leadership. Elena would take point on the personnel documentation. As VP of Human Resources, she had legitimate access to employment records, performance evaluations, and compensation data that would be crucial for establishing patterns of discrimination or retaliation. More importantly, she had the professional obligation to ensure that any terminations were properly documented and legally defensible. Margaret's biggest vulnerability is her impatience, Elena explained as she outlined her role in the plan. She's moving so fast to implement changes that she's not following proper HR protocols. If I start requiring full documentation for every personnel decision and insisting on adherence to company policies, She'll either have to slow down or start making mistakes that create legal liability. David would focus on client protection and business impact documentation. His relationships with major clients gave him unique insight into how Margaret's restructuring would affect revenue and customer satisfaction. If the changes started causing problems with client retention or service quality, David would be in position to document the impact and connect it directly to Margaret's decisions. The clients trust me to protect their interest, David's. If I start seeing service degradation or communication problems that result from Margaret's changes, I have a professional obligation to document those issues and report them to senior leadership. If senior leadership ignores those reports, that becomes part of the documentation trail. Thomas would handle board communications and strategic analysis. His long tenure at the company and relationships with board members who weren't part of Margaret's inner circle made him the ideal person to ensure that important information reached the right people at the right time. He would also be responsible for analyzing the business impact of Margaret's decisions and preparing reports that highlighted the risks her strategy created for the company. Margaret has been very careful to control information flow to the board, Thomas explained. But board members have independent relationships throughout the company, and they're getting informal feedback that contradicts the official reports Margaret provides. If I start channeling accurate information through those informal networks, board members will begin questioning whether they're getting the full picture from official sources. My role was the most complex and potentially the most dangerous. As the primary target of Margaret's campaign, I was in the unique position of being able to observe her methods up close while appearing to cooperate with her plans. I would document every interaction, every decision, every instruction that revealed her true motivation. Most importantly, I would be the one to coordinate our response and ensure that when the time came to present our case, we had an airtight documentation trail that showed exactly what Margaret had been doing and why. The key is timing, I explained to the group. We need to let Margaret make enough mistakes to hang herself, but we can't wait so long that the damage to the company becomes irreversible. We're walking a very fine line between gathering evidence and allowing real harm to occur. Thomas nodded. How will we know when it's time to act? When Bradley starts asking questions that Margaret can't answer without revealing her true agenda, when client complaints start reaching board members directly, when the financial impact of her decisions becomes visible in quarterly reports, I pause, or when Margaret makes a move that's so obviously retaliatory that it can't be explained as legitimate business decision-making. Elena opened a new document on her laptop. We should establish communication protocols and documentation standards. If we're going to make this work, we need to be systematic about how we gather and preserve evidence. Over the next hour, we developed a comprehensive system for tracking Margaret's actions and their consequences. Each of us would maintain detailed logs of relevant interactions and decisions. We would meet weekly to share information and assess our progress. Most importantly, we would create redundant backup systems to ensure that our documentation couldn't be destroyed or suppressed if Margaret discovered what we were doing. There's one more thing we need to discuss, David said, as we were wrapping up the planning session. What's our endgame? Are we trying to save our own positions, or are we trying to remove Margaret from her position entirely? It was a question I'd been wrestling with all week. In an ideal world, we would be able to expose Margaret's methods and convince the board to reverse her restructuring plans, while keeping her in place as a chastened, but reformed leader. But the more I learned about her history and her methods, the more convinced I became that halfway measures wouldn't work. Margaret Chen has spent her entire career perfecting a system for taking control of organizations and reshaping them according to her vision. She's not going to change her approach just because we make it more difficult for her to implement. If we want to protect the culture and values that have made Meridian successful, we need to ensure that she doesn't have the power to continue her systematic dismantling of collaborative leadership. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're talking about removing a board chair. That's not something that happens without extraordinary circumstances. Then we need to create extraordinary circumstances, Elena said. If Margaret's methods are as problematic as we believe they are, then documenting them properly should provide the evidence necessary to justify extraordinary action. David nodded. The clients I work with didn't choose Meridian just because of our financial performance. They chose us because of our culture, our responsiveness, our willingness to treat them as partners, rather than just revenue sources. If Margaret's changes start affecting those relationships, I'll have clients who are willing to speak directly to board members about their concerns. I felt a surge of gratitude for these 3 people who had chosen to trust me with their careers and their futures. Margaret Chen thinks she's playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. What she doesn't realize is that she's actually playing a completely different game than we are. She's playing for control, we're playing for something much more important. What's that? Thomas asked. We're playing for the right to define what leadership looks like in our industry. Margaret represents the old model: authoritarian, controlling, focused on power consolidation. We represent something different: collaborative, transparent, focused on results rather than hierarchy. I looked around the room at my allies. If we win, we don't just save our own careers, we prove that there's a better way to run a company. Elena smiled. And if we lose, at least we'll have fought for something that mattered. And Margaret Chen will have learned that destroying people's careers isn't as easy as she thought it would be. As we packed up our documents and prepared to leave Thomas's house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: absolute clarity about what I was fighting for and why it mattered. Margaret had made the mistake of thinking that threatening our jobs would make us desperate and compliant. Instead, she had freed us from the fear of consequences and given us the motivation to fight back with everything we had. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in my career, I was playing by my own rules. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Seattle drizzle that seemed to match the gray uncertainty hanging over Meridian Financial. I sat in my office, reviewing the agenda for the executive leadership meeting that would officially introduce Bradley Walsh as our new chief operating officer. In less than 2 hours, I would need to walk into that conference room and deliver the performance of my career: the gracious, professional colleague, welcoming her new supervisor with enthusiasm, and pledging complete support for his success. The irony wasn't lost on me that my acting skills had become the most important qualification for my job. I had spent the weekend rehearsing my responses to the various scenarios we anticipate. Thomas had role-played Margaret's likely talking points about collaborative leadership and smooth transitions. Elena had helped me practice maintaining appropriate facial expressions when Margaret praised Bradley's qualification. David had even coached me on the right tone for offering my assistance with the transition process. What none of them could prepare me for was the emotional complexity of sitting in a room with people who were plotting my professional destruction while pretending that everything was perfectly normal. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the executive conference room on the 34th floor. I arrived precisely 5 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained transition notes I'd prepared for Bradley and wearing what I privately thought of as my concerned but supportive colleague expression. Margaret was already there, positioned at the head of the table in a way that made it clear she would be running the meeting, despite the fact that our current CEO Robert Chen was technically the most senior person in the room. Bradley Walsh looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a corporate executive in a television drama. Tall, impeccably groomed, expensive suit, confident handshake, and the kind of smile that was designed to inspire trust without revealing anything about the person behind it. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of easy charm that came from a lifetime of being taken seriously in professional settings. "Rachel Martinez," he said, extending his hand as I approached. "I've heard wonderful things about your work here. I'm looking forward to collaborating with you." I shook his hand and gave him my most professional smile. "Congratulations on the appointment, Bradley. I'm excited to work with you and support your vision for the company." Margaret watched this exchange with the satisfied expression of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as expected. She had no idea that every word of this conversation would be transcribed in my personal notes within an hour of the meeting's conclusion. Robert Chen called the meeting to order with his usual diplomatic efficiency. "I'd like to welcome everyone to what I hope will be the first of many productive leadership meetings under Bradley's guidance. Bradley, would you like to share your initial thoughts about your priorities as CEO?" Bradley stood up, which surprised me,
Most of our executive meetings were fairly informal affairs where people remained seated, unless they were giving formal presentations, but Bradley clearly wanted to establish his presence and authority from the beginning. Thank you, Rob. I'm honored to be joining the Meridian team, and I want to start by acknowledging the incredible foundation that's been built here. The financial performance, client relationships and market position are all testament to the excellent work that's been done by this leadership team. So far, so good. Standard new executive rhetoric that acknowledged existing successes while positioning himself to take credit for future improvement. That said, Bradley continued, I also believe that every leadership transition is an opportunity to examine our processes and identify areas where we can become even more efficient and effective. Margaret and I have been discussing some strategic initiatives that could help us streamline operations and position Meridian for even stronger growth in the coming years. I felt my stomach tight. Bradley was already aligning himself publicly with Margaret's agenda, which meant either he was fully aware of what that agenda entailed, or he was even more naive than we'd hoped. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Bradley brings a fresh perspective that I think will be valuable as we consider how to optimize our organizational structure for maximum efficiency. Alina, who was sitting across the table from me, maintained perfect composure, but I caught the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes that told me she was processing the same implications. I'm curious about what kind of structural optimizations you're considering, David said in his characteristic diplomatic tone. Our current departmental organization has been pretty effective for client service delivery. Bradley smiled in a way that was probably meant to be reassuring but struck me as slightly condescending. Absolutely, David. The client service quality here is outstanding. We're thinking more about administrative efficiency and leadership span of control, making sure that decision-making processes are as streamlined as possible. Thomas, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Can you elaborate on what streamlined decision-making would look like in practice? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Bradley's answer would tell us whether he understood what Margaret's efficiency improvements really meant. Well, for example, we've identified several areas where multiple executives are involved in decisions that could probably be handled by a single point of authority. Budget approvals, personnel decisions, client strategy adjustments. The goal would be to reduce bureaucratic delays and ensure that decisions get made quickly and consistently. There it was. Bradley was either completely naive about the implications of centralizing decision-making authority, or he was deliberately using euphemisms to disguise what was essentially a power grab. Either way, he had just publicly committed himself to implementing Margaret's plan. I decided to test how much he actually understood about what he was proposing. That makes sense from an efficiency standpoint, Bradley. I'm curious about how we'd maintain the collaborative oversight that's been important for risk management and quality control. Bradley's pause was just a fraction too long, and his smile became just a little too bright. Great question, Rachel. Obviously, we want to maintain appropriate oversight.
We're thinking more about eliminating redundant approval processes rather than eliminating oversight entirely. It was a non-answer that told me everything I needed to know. Bradley hadn't thought through the practical implications of the changes he was proposing, which meant he was operating from talking points that Margaret had provided rather than his own strategic analysis. Margaret jumped in smoothly. The key is making sure that our most experienced executives can focus on high-level strategy rather than getting bogged down in operational details that could be handled at lower levels. Robert Chen nodded thoughtfully. How do we ensure that streamlining doesn't compromise the communication and coordination that's been crucial to our client satisfaction ratings? Another excellent question, Bradley said, and I could see him mentally reaching for another talking point. We'll want to be very careful about maintaining communication channels while eliminating unnecessary approval bottlenecks. Elena spoke for the first time since the meeting began. From an HR perspective, I'd want to make sure that any changes to decision-making authority are properly documented and that all affected staff understand the new procedures. Particularly for personnel decisions, we need to ensure compliance with company policies and legal requirements. I had to admire Elena's approach. She was positioning herself as the helpful HR professional who wanted to ensure proper implementation, while actually creating requirements that would force Margaret and Bradley to document their plans in ways that could later be used as evidence. Absolutely, Margaret said. We'll want to work closely with HR to ensure that any procedural changes are properly implemented. I'd be happy to prepare documentation templates and compliance checklists, Elena continued. When are you thinking about beginning implementation? Bradley looked at Margaret, which confirmed what we'd suspected about their decision-making dynamic. We want to move fairly quickly to capture the efficiency benefits, but we also want to be thoughtful about the process. Maybe we could start with a pilot program in 1 or 2 departments. Thomas looked up from his notes. Which departments were you thinking about for the pilot? Another glance between Bradley and Margaret. We haven't finalized those details yet, Margaret said. We'll want to choose departments where the potential benefits are most clear and where the changes can be implemented with minimal disruption. I knew exactly which departments they were thinking about, mine, Elena's, and Dave. The pilot program would be the testing ground for their restructuring plan, and we would be the test subjects. I think that's a smart approach, I said, maintaining my helpful colleague tone. I'd be happy to work with you on analyzing the potential impact in any departments you're considering. Having detailed baseline metrics would help us measure the effectiveness of the changes. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That's exactly the kind of collaborative attitude that will make this transition successful. What she meant was that she was pleased to see me cooperating with my own professional execution. What she didn't realize was that I had just positioned myself to have access to all the planning documents for their pilot program. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering budget forecasts and quarterly goals, but the real business had been concluded. Bradley had publicly committed to implementing Margaret's efficiency improvement. Elena had created documentation requirements that would force them to put their plans in writing. David had established his role as the voice of client service concerns. Thomas had positioned himself as the institutional memory who would need to be consulted about implementation details. And I had successfully presented myself as the enthusiastic supporter who wanted to help with metrics and analysis. As the meeting broke up, Bradley approached me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Rachel, I really appreciate your offer to help with the analysis. Margaret has told me great things about your strategic thinking, and I'd love to get your input on how we can make these changes as effective as possible. I'm excited to contribute, I replied, meaning every word. I think you'll find that having detailed documentation of the process will be incredibly valuable. Margaret watched this exchange with satisfaction, apparently seeing it as confirmation that her intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. I was being cooperative and helpful, exactly as she'd expected. What she didn't see was Elena taking careful notes about the timeline and decision-making process that had been discussed. She didn't notice David making mental calculations about which client relationships might be affected by the proposed changes. She didn't observe Thomas quietly assessing which board members might have concerns about centralizing decision-making authority. Most importantly, she didn't realize that her new COO had just revealed himself to be either naive enough to be manipulated or ambitious enough to be dangerous. Either way, Bradley Walsh was not going to be the compliant ally that Margaret thought she had found. As I walked back to my office, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The performance phase of our plan was officially underway, and it had gone better than I'd dared to hope. Margaret and Bradley had committed themselves to a course of action that would require them to document their decisions, justify their methods, and implement changes that would inevitably create resistance throughout the organization. They thought they were managing a smooth transition to a more efficient organizational structure. What they had actually done was create the conditions for their own downfall. I sat down at my desk and opened a new document on my computer. At the top of the page, I typed COO transition meeting, documentation log, and began transcribing every detail I could remember from the previous hour. The game had begun, and Margaret Chen had just made her first major mistake. The week following Bradley's introduction was a masterclass in corporate theater. On the surface, everything appeared to be proceeding smoothly with the leadership transition. Bradley was attending meetings, reviewing departmental reports, and scheduling one-on-one sessions with senior staff to get a better understanding of current operations. Margaret was maintaining her role as the experienced board chair, providing guidance to the new CEO, and I was playing my part as the helpful senior executive, eager to support the new leadership structure. Beneath the surface, however, we were executing the most sophisticated intelligence operation of my career. Alina had wasted no time implementing her documentation requirement. By Wednesday, she had sent Bradley and Margaret a comprehensive memo outlining the HR compliance procedures that would need to be followed for any organizational changes. The memo was a work of art, professional, thorough, and absolutely uncompromising in its insistence on proper documentation for every decision that could affect personnel. "I've created a paper trail that they can't avoid," Alina explained during our Thursday evening check-in call. "Every procedural change, every personnel decision, every budget reallocation that affects staffing levels will now require written justification that goes through my office. If they want to eliminate positions or restructure departments, they'll have to create documentation that explains their reasoning." What Alina didn't mention, but what we all understood, was that this documentation would provide exactly the evidence we needed to prove that their decisions were politically motivated, rather than business-driven. David had taken a different but equally effective approach. He'd scheduled individual meetings with each of our major clients to conduct what he called transition impact assessments. Ostensibly, these meetings were designed to ensure that clients understood how the leadership changes might affect their service delivery. In reality, David was creating a detailed record of client satisfaction levels and service expectations that could be used to measure the impact of Margaret's restructuring. "The clients are already asking questions," David reported during our weekend strategy session at Thomas's house. "3 of our biggest accounts have specifically requested assurance that their account management teams won't be disrupted by the organizational changes. They're nervous about anything that might affect service quality." Thomas had been working his magic with board communication. As one of the longest-tenured executives at Meridian, he had relationships with board members that predated Margaret's arrival, and those relationships were proving invaluable for gathering intelligence about the internal politics of the board itself. "Margaret's support on the board isn't as solid as she thinks it is," Thomas revealed. "There are at least 3 members who have been expressing private concerns about the speed of the changes she's been implementing. They're not opposed to organizational improvements, but they're worried about making too many changes too quickly without proper analysis of the potential risks." This information was crucial for our time. If we moved too early before Margaret's plan had created visible problems, we'd look like disgruntled employees trying to undermine legitimate business decisions. But if we waited too long, the damage to the company might be irreversible. Knowing that some board members were already skeptical gave us a potential opening for when the time came to present our evidence. My own role in the operation was the most complex because it required me to maintain the closest contact with both Margaret and Bradley while gathering intelligence about their actual plan. I'd volunteered to help with the efficiency analysis that would supposedly identify opportunities for streamlining, which gave me legitimate access to organizational charts, budget data, and strategic planning documents. What I discovered during my analysis was both more and less than what we'd expected. Margaret's plan was indeed comprehensive and systematic, but it was also more sophisticated than we'd initially realized. She wasn't just planning to eliminate a few senior executives who might challenge her authority. She was implementing a complete restructuring of the company's operational philosophy. The documents I reviewed revealed a vision of Meridian Financial that was fundamentally different from the collaborative, client-focused organization we'd built over the past decade. Margaret's new structure would centralize decision-making authority in a small group of senior executives, reduce the autonomy of departmental managers, and implement standardized procedures that prioritized consistency over responsiveness. It wasn't necessarily an evil plan, but it was a plan that would transform Meridian into a completely different kind of company. And the people who would lose the most in this transformation were exactly the people who had made Meridian successful in the first place: creative problem solvers, relationship builders, and independent thinkers who thrived in collaborative environments. The most disturbing discovery was a document titled Change Management Strategy that outlined Margaret's approach to managing resistance to the new structure. The document explicitly identified potential sources of opposition and recommended strategies for neutralizing that opposition through a combination of incentives, reassignments, and if necessary terminations. My name was on the list of potential opposition sources, along with Elena's and David. But we weren't the only ones. Margaret had identified more than a dozen employees throughout the organization who she considered threats to the implementation of her new structure. Some were senior executives, but others were mid-level managers, and even individual contributors who had reputations for innovative thinking or strong client relationships. Margaret wasn't just planning a leadership restructuring, she was planning a cultural purge. Reading that document was the moment I fully understood what we were fighting against. This wasn't about protecting our own careers anymore. Margaret's plan would destroy everything that made Meridian a place where talented people wanted to work and where clients chose to do business. I made copies of everything I could access legally, and I began building a comprehensive analysis of how Margaret's proposed changes would affect every aspect of the company's operation: financial projections, client satisfaction metrics, employee retention rates, competitive positioning. I created models that showed the likely impact of centralizing decision-making and reducing departmental autonomy. The results were sobering. Margaret's changes would probably improve short-term operational efficiency, but they would almost certainly reduce long-term growth potential and client satisfaction. The company would become more predictable and easier to manage, but it would also become less innovative and less responsive to market changes. Armed with this analysis, I requested a meeting with Bradley to discuss my findings. It was a carefully calculated risk. If Bradley was fully committed to Margaret's plan, sharing this information could reveal my opposition and compromise our entire operation. But if Bradley was the naive newcomer we suspected him to be, presenting him with detailed data about the risks of the restructuring might plant seeds of doubt about Margaret's guidance. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in Bradley's office. I arrived with a professionally bound presentation that looked like exactly the kind of strategic analysis that a new COO should want to see from his senior staff. "Rachel, thank you for putting this together," Bradley said as I handed him the document. "I've been looking forward to getting your perspective on the organizational opportunities we discussed." I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but sitting across from Bradley in his new office, I felt the weight of how much depended on the next 30 minutes. If this went well, we might gain a powerful ally or at least neutralize a potential opponent. If it went badly, our entire operation could be exposed. "I've tried to be as thorough as possible," I said, opening my own copy to the executive summary. "I think you'll find some interesting insights about both the opportunities and the potential risks of the changes we're considering." Bradley began reading, and I watched his expression carefully for any signs of how he was processing the information. The first few pages covered the efficiency benefits that Margaret had emphasized: reduced redundancy, faster decision-making, clearer lines of authority. Bradley nodded along with these sections, which was what I'd expected, but as he continued reading, his expression began to change. The sections on client satisfaction risks, employee retention concerns, and competitive positioning challenges were clearly new information for him. Margaret had obviously focused on the benefits of her plan without providing Bradley with a comprehensive analysis of the potential downside. "This client satisfaction data is concerning," Bradley said, looking up from the document. "These numbers suggest that our current service quality is heavily dependent on the flexibility and autonomy of individual account managers. That's been one of our key competitive advantages." I agree. "Our clients often tell us that they chose Meridian because we're able to customize our approach to their specific needs, rather than forcing them into standardized service packages." Bradley continued reading, and I could see him beginning to understand the complexity of what Margaret had presented as a straightforward efficiency improvement. The proposed changes weren't just administrative adjustments, they were fundamental alterations to the company's operational philosophy that could have far-reaching consequences. Margaret mentioned that these changes had been successful at other companies, Bradley said. "Do you have any data on how similar restructuring efforts have affected client retention and employee satisfaction in comparable organizations?" This was exactly the question I'd been hoping he would ask. "I've included some industry analysis in the appendix. The results are mixed,
but there's a pattern where companies that implement these kinds of changes see short-term efficiency gains, followed by longer-term challenges with innovation and client retention. Bradley flipped to the appendix and spent several minutes reviewing the comparative data. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. "Rachel, this analysis suggests that the restructuring could create significant risks for our market position and client relationships. Has Margaret seen this data?" I chose my words carefully. I shared some preliminary findings with Margaret, but she felt that the benefits would outweigh the risks. She's confident that proper implementation can minimize the potential downsides. It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly false either. Margaret had dismissed my concerns without really engaging with the analysis, which was essentially the same thing. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring at the document in his hands. "I need to think about this more carefully. The efficiency benefits are compelling, but if there are significant risks to client satisfaction and employee retention, we need to make sure we're addressing those concerns before we move forward. I'd be happy to work with you on developing risk mitigation strategies," I offer. "If we're going to implement these changes, we should be very strategic about timing and sequencing to minimize disruption." "Yes, that makes sense." Bradley closed the document and looked at me directly. "Rachel, can I ask you something? Do you support these organizational changes?" It was the moment of truth. Bradley was asking me to reveal my position, and my answer would determine whether he saw me as an ally or a potential threat. "I support making Meridian as successful as possible," I said carefully. "If these changes will genuinely improve our performance and client satisfaction, then I'm fully behind them. But I also think we have an obligation to be honest about the risks and make sure we're not sacrificing long-term success for short-term efficiency gains." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's exactly the kind of balanced perspective I need from my senior team. Would you be willing to work with me on developing a more comprehensive implementation strategy that addresses the concerns you've identified?" "Absolutely," I said. And for the first time in weeks I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. As I left Bradley's office, I realized that our strategy was working even better than we'd hoped. Bradley was beginning to understand that Margaret's plan was more complex and risky than she'd led him to believe. More importantly, he was starting to see me as a valuable advisor rather than a potential threat. Margaret had made a critical error in her assessment of Bradley Wall. She'd assumed that his lack of experience with Meridian's culture would make him dependent on her guidance. What she hadn't considered was that his lack of experience also made him genuinely interested in learning about the company he'd been hired to lead. Bradley wasn't the compliant puppet that Margaret thought she'd found. He was a competent executive who wanted to make good decisions, and he was beginning to realize that making good decisions required more information than Margaret had provided. Our plan was entering its next phase, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like we might actually win. The following week brought an unexpected development that initially seemed like a setback but ultimately proved to be the break we'd been waiting for. Margaret called an emergency executive meeting for Wednesday morning, ostensibly to address what she called communication gaps that had emerged during the transition planning process. I arrived at the conference room to find Margaret and Bradley already seated at opposite ends of the table, a seating arrangement that immediately told me more about the state of their relationship than any official communication could have. The collaborative dynamic they'd displayed during Bradley's introduction meeting had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like tension. Elena arrived next, carrying her ever-present documentation folder and wearing the expression of someone who was prepared for anything. David followed closely behind, his diplomatic demeanor intact, but his eyes alert for whatever drama was about to unfold. Thomas was the last to join us, slipping into his usual seat with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew what was coming. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules on short notice," Margaret began, her tone carrying just enough edge to signal that this wasn't going to be a routine meeting. "I wanted to address some concerns that have been raised about our transition planning process and ensure that everyone understands their role in implementing the organizational improvements we've discussed." Bradley shifted in his chair, and I caught the briefest flash of annoyance across his features before he composed himself. It was clear that he and Margaret had already had at least one conversation about this topic, and it hadn't gone smooth. Specifically, Margaret continued, it's come to my attention that some members of the leadership team have been conducting independent analysis of our efficiency initiatives, without coordinating with the overall strategic planning process. She was talking about me, of course. My analysis of the restructuring risks had apparently reached Margaret's attention, either through Bradley or through some other channel I hadn't anticipated. The question was whether Margaret saw this as an attempt to undermine her authority, or simply as uncoordinated effort that needed to be managed. I want to be clear that initiative and independent thinking are valuable qualities in senior executives, Margaret said, looking directly at me. However, it's important that all analysis and strategic planning be coordinated through proper channels to ensure consistency and avoid confusion. Bradley cleared his throat. Margaret, I should clarify that I specifically requested analysis from my senior team to help inform our implementation strategy. I consider that kind of comprehensive evaluation to be a crucial part of responsible leadership. The room went very quiet. Bradley had just publicly disagreed with Margaret's characterization of my analysis as unauthorized independent initiative. He was positioning it as legitimate strategic work that he had requested as part of his due diligence process. Margaret's smile became noticeably tighter. Of course, Bradley, I wasn't suggesting that your request for analysis were inappropriate. I was simply pointing out that it would be helpful to coordinate these efforts to avoid duplication and ensure that all relevant factors are being considered. What specific coordination are you thinking about? Elena asked, her tone perfectly professional, but her question pointed enough to put Margaret on the defense. Moving forward, I'd like all strategic analysis related to organizational changes to be reviewed by the board chair's office before being shared with other executives. Margaret replied, this will help ensure that the analysis is complete and that it incorporates all relevant strategic considerations. Thomas looked up from his notes. Would that review process apply to all strategic analysis, or just analysis related to the restructuring initiative? It was a brilliant question that forced Margaret to choose between appearing to micromanage all executive decision-making, or admitting that she was specifically trying to control information related to her restructuring plan. Initially, let's focus on restructuring-related analysis, Margaret said, trying to sound reasonable. Once we've established effective coordination procedures, we can evaluate whether to extend the process to other strategic initiatives. Bradley's expression had grown increasingly uncomfortable during this exchange. Margaret, I appreciate the desire for coordination, but I also need to maintain the ability to request analysis and information from my senior team without creating bureaucratic delay. As COO, I have a responsibility to make informed decisions, and that requires access to comprehensive data and analysis. There it was. Bradley was asserting his independence from Margaret's control, and he was doing it in front of the entire senior leadership team. Margaret had pushed too hard too fast and had inadvertently created a public conflict with the COO she was supposed to be mentoring. Of course, Margaret said, her voice taking on a strained quality, I'm not suggesting that we create bureaucratic obstacles. I'm simply proposing that we ensure coordination to maximize efficiency. David leaned forward slightly. From a client service perspective, how would this coordination process affect our ability to respond quickly to client needs or market changes that require strategic adjustment? Margaret was beginning to look trapped. Every question was highlighting the potential problems with her coordination requirements, and Bradley was clearly becoming more skeptical of her motives with each exchange. The goal is to improve our responsiveness, not hinder it, Margaret said, but her answer lacked conviction. I decided it was time to test just how far Bradley was willing to go in asserting his independence. Bradley, would you like me to continue with the risk analysis you requested, or should I wait for the coordination procedures to be finalized? Bradley didn't hesitate. Please continue with the analysis. I need that information to make informed decisions about implementation timing and strategy. Margaret's face flushed slightly, but she couldn't directly contradict Bradley's instruction without making their conflict even more obvious. Fine, but I'd appreciate being kept informed about the scope and findings of any analysis that could affect board-level strategic decisions. Absolutely, I said. I'll make sure you receive copies of all relevant documentation. What I didn't say was that I would be very careful about what I chose to characterize as relevant to board-level decisions. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but the real business had been concluded. Margaret had attempted to assert control over the information flow related to her restructuring plan, and Bradley had publicly rejected that control. More importantly, the other senior executives had witnessed the conflict and seen Bradley position himself as someone who valued independent analysis and comprehensive information. As we filed out of the conference room, Bradley approached me discreetly. "Rachel, could I speak with you for a moment?" We walked to his office, and he closed the door behind us before speaking. "I'm starting to get the sense that there are some political dynamics here that I wasn't fully briefed on during the hiring process," Bradley said. "Can you give me your honest assessment of what's happening?" It was exactly the opening I'd been hoping for, but it was also the most dangerous moment of our entire operation. Bradley was essentially asking me to reveal my opinion about Margaret's leadership and motivation. If I misjudged his intentions or his trustworthiness, I could be providing him with information that would get back to Margaret and destroy everything we'd been working toward. But if I was right about Bradley's character and his growing concerns about Margaret's approach, this could be the opportunity to gain a powerful ally. "Bradley, can I speak candidly?" I asked. "Please do." I took a deep breath and made the decision that would determine the success or failure of our entire plan. "I think Margaret has a very specific vision for how this company should operate, and she's been working systematically to implement that vision."
The restructuring isn't just about efficiency. It's about fundamentally changing the culture and operational philosophy of Meridian Financial. Bradley was quiet for a moment. "And you don't think that change would be beneficial?" "I think some changes could be beneficial, but I'm concerned about the speed and scope of what's being proposed. The analysis I've been working on suggests that the changes could create significant risks for client retention and employee satisfaction. More importantly, I'm not convinced that the decision-making process has adequately considered those risks." "What do you mean by the decision-making process?" This was the moment of truth. "I mean that the restructuring plan seems to have been developed primarily by Margaret, with limited input from the executives who would be responsible for implementation or who understand the operational details that could be affected by the changes." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's consistent with what I'm starting to observe. Margaret has very strong opinions about how things should be done, and she doesn't seem particularly interested in alternative perspectives." "That's been my experience as well," I said carefully. "Rachel, can I ask you something directly? Do you think Margaret is trying to control my decisions as COO?" The question hung in the air between us. Bradley was asking me to confirm what he was already beginning to suspect, that Margaret saw him as a puppet rather than a partner. "I think Margaret has been with this company for a long time, and she has very clear ideas about how it should be run," I said. "I also think she may not fully appreciate that you were hired to bring fresh leadership perspective, not just to implement predetermined decisions." Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "Rachel, I want you to continue with your risk analysis, and I want you to be completely thorough. Don't worry about coordination requirements or political sensitivity. I need to understand all the potential implications of these changes before we move forward with implementation. You'll have my complete analysis within a week," I promised. As I left Bradley's office, I felt a surge of triumph that I had to work hard to suppress. Margaret's attempt to control information flow had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me from Bradley, she had created a situation where Bradley was questioning her judgment and turning to me for independent analysis. Our plan was working better than we'd dared to hope. Margaret's overconfidence was leading her to make increasingly aggressive moves to consolidate control, and those moves were creating exactly the kind of resistance and questioning that would ultimately expose her methods. I returned to my office and immediately called Thomas with a coded message about needing to discuss quarterly projections. Within an hour, he appeared at my door with coffee and the expression of someone who was ready to hear good news. "How did it go?" he asked once my door was closed. "Better than we expected. Margaret just made a major tactical error, and Bradley is starting to see her for what she really is." I gave Thomas a detailed account of the meeting and my subsequent conversation with Bradley. By the time I finished, Thomas was smiling. "Margaret's losing control of her own plan," he observed. "She's so focused on maintaining authority that she's creating conflict with the person she needs as an ally. Exactly. And the beautiful part is that every move she makes to reassert control just makes Bradley more suspicious of her motives. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Rachel, I think we need to accelerate our timeline. If Bradley is genuinely starting to question Margaret's judgment, we need to be ready to provide him with comprehensive documentation of her methods when he's ready to see it. I nodded. I'll have the complete risk analysis ready by early next week. But Thomas, I think we also need to prepare for the possibility that Margaret is going to escalate her efforts to maintain control. If she feels like she's losing influence over Bradley, she might try to eliminate perceived threats more quickly than we originally anticipated. You mean she might try to fire you before the restructuring plan is officially implemented? It's possible. Margaret's been methodical up to this point, but people make desperate decisions when they feel cornered. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then we need to make sure that if Margaret does try to eliminate you prematurely, it backfires on her completely. As Thomas left my office, I realized that our operation had entered a new and more dangerous phase. Margaret was beginning to lose control of the situation, which made her both weaker and more unpredictable. We had gained a potential ally in Bradley, but we had also forced Margaret into a position where she might take desperate action to protect her position. The next few weeks would determine whether our strategy succeeded in exposing Margaret's methods, or whether her desperation would lead her to destroy us before we could complete our documentation of her abuses. Either way, the endgame was approaching, and there would be no more opportunities for half measures or strategic retreats. 3 weeks later, everything started falling apart at once, and it began with a phone call that I wasn't supposed to receive. I was in my office early on a Tuesday morning, working on the final sections of my comprehensive risk analysis for Bradley, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the area code looked familiar. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Rachel Martinez, I answered. Miss Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh from Pacific Holdings. The name hit me like a physical blow. Pacific Holdings was one of our largest clients, and Jennifer Walsh was their chief financial officer. More importantly, she was calling me directly instead of going through our normal client service channels. Hello, Jennifer. What can I do for you? I'm calling because I received some concerning information yesterday, and I wanted to verify it directly with someone I trust. Her voice carried the kind of tension that made my stomach clench. I was told that Meridian is planning to reassign our account management team without consulting us about the transition. Is that accurate? My blood turned to ice. Margaret's restructuring plan was already being implemented, and she was doing it without the careful documentation and client communication protocols that Elena had insisted were necessary. Jennifer, I haven't been informed of any immediate changes to your account management team. Can you tell me where you heard this information? One of your junior account coordinators called our accounting department yesterday, asking for updated contact information for budget discussion. When our people asked why the information was needed, they were told that there would be new personnel handling our account starting next month. Jennifer's voice was sharp with concern. Rachel, Pacific Holdings has been working with your company for 6 years. We chose Meridian specifically because of the consistency and expertise of our account team. If changes are being made, we expect to be consulted as part of the process. I felt my heart racing as I processed the implication. Margaret was moving ahead with client account reassignments without following proper transition procedure. She was either so confident in her control that she thought she could bypass normal protocols, or she was so concerned about resistance to her plan that she was trying to implement it before anyone could object. Jennifer, let me look into this immediately and call you back within the hour. I want to make sure we have accurate information about any potential changes and that you're fully informed about anything that might affect your service. I appreciate that, Rachel, but I need to be clear. If Meridian is planning to disrupt our account management without proper consultation, Pacific Holdings will need to consider whether this relationship is still meeting our needs. The call ended, and I sat staring at my phone as the full scope of what was happening became clear. Margaret wasn't waiting for Bradley to implement the restructuring gradually. She was moving ahead with account reassignments on her own authority, probably justifying it as operational efficiency improvements, that didn't require executive approval, but she had made a critical error. By bypassing proper client communication procedures, she was creating exactly the kind of service disruption that would validate every concern I'd raised in my risk analysis. More importantly, she was doing it in a way that could be directly traced back to her decision-making. I immediately called David's extension. "We have a problem. Can you come to my office right now?" David appeared within 2 minutes, took one look at my expression, and closed the door behind him. "What happened?" I told him about Jennifer Walsh's call and what it implied about Margaret's timeline. David's face grew progressively more grim as I spoke. "Rachel, if Margaret is reassigning client accounts without proper transition procedures, she's violating our standard service protocol. Those protocols exist specifically to prevent the kind of client dissatisfaction that could cost us major accounts. How many other clients might be affected?" David pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. "If she's moving ahead with the full restructuring plan, potentially dozens. The account reassignments she's been planning would affect about 40% of our client base. And how many of those clients would react the way Pacific Holdings is reacting? Most of our major clients specifically value relationship continuity and advance consultation on any changes that could affect their service. If Margaret is implementing these changes without proper client communication, we're going to have a client satisfaction crisis within weeks." I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Margaret's impatience was creating exactly the kind of business crisis that would expose the fundamental flaws in her approach, but we needed to document everything carefully to ensure that the responsibility for the crisis landed squarely on her shoulders. "David, I need you to start calling your client contacts immediately. Find out how many other companies have received information about account changes, and document their responses. If Margaret is creating client service problems, we need comprehensive evidence of the scope and impact." "Already on it," David said, heading for the door. "Rachel, this could be the break we've been waiting for." My next call was to Elena. "Emergency meeting in conference room C. Bring everything." Elena arrived 15 minutes later with her laptop and 3 file folders. "What's happening?" I explained about Pacific Holdings and our suspicions about unauthorized account reassignments. Elena's expression grew increasingly alarmed as I spoke. "Rachel, if Margaret is implementing personnel changes without going through proper HR procedures, she's creating legal liability for the company. Employee reassignments, especially ones that affect client relationships, require documentation and proper notification procedure." "What kind of legal liability?" "Breach of contract with clients who have specific account management terms in their service agreements. Potential employment law violations if employees are being reassigned without proper consultation. And if any of these changes result in wrongful termination claims, the company could face significant financial exposure." Elena opened her laptop and began typing rapidly. "I need to check the personnel action logs to see what changes have been authorized through my office." After several minutes of searching, Elena looked up with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Rachel, there are no personnel action requests in the system for any of the account reassignments that Margaret has apparently been implementing. She's making these changes without any HR documentation or approval. Is that a fireable offense?" "It's a fireable offense for any other executive in the company. For a board chair, it's the kind of violation that could result in removal for cause." I felt the pieces of our plan clicking into place. Margaret's overconfidence had led her to bypass the very procedures that were designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of problem she was creating. She had given us the evidence we needed to prove that her leadership was not just authoritarian but actually dangerous to the company's operational integrity. "Elena, I need you to document every unauthorized personnel action you can find. Create a comprehensive report that shows the scope of the violations and the potential legal exposure they're creating. How quickly do you need it?" "By the end of the day, I think we're going to need to present this information to Bradley very soon." Elena packed up her materials and headed for the door, but she paused before leaving. "Rachel, are we really going to do this? Are we really going to try to remove a board chair? We're going to present evidence of serious procedural violations and let the appropriate authorities make decisions about consequences. Margaret created this situation. We're just documenting it." After Elena left, I called Thomas and asked him to come to my office for an urgent consultation about quarterly projections. When he arrived, I filled him in on the morning's developments. "This is perfect," Thomas said when I finished. "Margaret has made exactly the kind of unforced error that we needed to complete our case against her. But Rachel, we need to be very careful about timing. If we move too quickly, it could look like we orchestrated this crisis. If we wait too long, the client satisfaction problems could become irreversible. What's your recommendation?" We present everything to Bradley today: the risk analysis, Elena's documentation of procedural violations, David's client satisfaction data. We give him the complete picture and let him decide how to handle it. And if Bradley isn't ready to take action against Margaret, Thomas smiled grimly, then Margaret will continue making mistakes, and the board will eventually have to address the client satisfaction crisis and legal liability she's creating. Either way, her days as board chair are numbered. I spent the rest of the morning finalizing my risk analysis report and preparing a comprehensive presentation that connected Margaret's unauthorized personnel actions to the client satisfaction problems they were creating. By noon, David had called back with confirmation that 7 major clients had received notification of account team changes without proper consultation, and 3 of them were expressing serious concerns about the impact on their service. At 1 o'clock, I called Bradley's office and asked for an emergency meeting to discuss urgent client satisfaction issues. His assistant scheduled me for 2:30, which gave me just enough time to coordinate with Elena and David to ensure that all our documentation was consistent and comprehensive. The meeting that followed was the most important hour of my professional career. I walked into Bradley's office carrying a presentation folder that contained everything we had discovered about Margaret's methods, her unauthorized actions, and their impact on client relationships and company operations. "Rachel, your message mentioned urgent client satisfaction issues," Bradley said as I took a seat across from his desk. "What's happening?" I opened my folder and handed him a single-page executive summary. "Bradley, I need to present you with information about serious procedural violations that are creating immediate risks for client retention and potential legal liability for the company." Bradley's expression grew serious as he read the summary. "These are significant allegations, Rachel. Do you have documentation to support them?" For the next 45 minutes, I walked Bradley through every piece of evidence we had gathered: Elena's documentation of unauthorized personnel actions, David's client satisfaction data, my analysis of the legal and financial risks that Margaret's approach was creating, the pattern of violations that showed systematic disregard for company policies and client service standards. Bradley asked detailed questions about each piece of evidence, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was presenting. By the time I finished, his expression had shifted from skepticism to concern to something that looked very much like anger. "Rachel, if this documentation is accurate, Margaret has created a situation that could result in millions of dollars in lost revenue and significant legal exposure for the company. That's my assessment as well. And you believe that these actions were taken without proper authorization or consultation. The evidence suggests that Margaret has been implementing changes on her own authority without following established procedures for client communication, employee notification, or board oversight." Bradley was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents I'd provided. "Rachel, I need to ask you directly, is this presentation motivated by personal concerns about the restructuring plan, or by genuine business concerns about procedural violation?" It was the question I'd been expecting, and I had prepared for it carefully. "Bradley, 6 weeks ago I would have said that my primary concern was personal. I didn't want to lose my position, and I was frustrated about being passed over for promotion. But the evidence I've presented today isn't about my career prospects. It's about serious violations of company policy that are creating immediate business risks. And if I take action based on this information, what outcome are you expecting?" "I'm expecting that you'll address the procedural violations, implement proper client communication protocols, and ensure that future organizational changes follow established company policies. What happens to specific individuals as a result of those actions isn't my decision to make." Bradley nodded slowly. "I need to discuss this information with the board immediately. Rachel, I want you to understand that if these allegations prove to be accurate,
there will be serious consequences for everyone involved in the procedural violations. I understand, and I also want you to understand that if these allegations prove to be accurate, or motivated by personal grievances, there will be serious consequences for the people making false accusations. I understand that as well. As I left Bradley's office, I felt a strange combination of relief and terror. We had presented our case, and Bradley was taking it seriously, but we had also crossed a line that we couldn't step back over. By tomorrow, either Margaret would be facing serious consequences for her actions, or we would be facing serious consequences for challenging her authority. I returned to my office and sent coded messages to Thomas, Elena, and David, letting them know that the presentation had been complete. Then I sat down at my desk and tried to prepare myself for whatever was going to happen next. The endgame had begun, and within 24 hours, we would know whether our strategy had succeeded in exposing Margaret's abuses, or whether she had successfully positioned herself to survive our challenge. Either way, there would be no going back. The phone rang at 4:30. It was Bradley's assistant asking me to return to his office immediately for a follow-up discussion. As I walked down the hallway toward what could be either vindication or professional destruction, I realized that I had never felt more certain that we had done the right thing. Margaret Chen had spent months systematically undermining everything that made Meridian Financial a great place to work and a trusted partner for our clients. She had violated company policies, ignored legal requirements, and prioritized her personal vision of control over the business interests of the organization. Now she was going to face the consequences of those choices, and if our plan had worked, she was going to discover that the people she had tried to eliminate were much more dangerous as opponents than they had ever been as colleagues. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time in my career, I was walking into a corporate battlefield, as someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Margaret Chen had called me too emotional to leave. She was about to learn what real emotion looked like, when it was channeled through strategic intelligence, comprehensive documentation, and absolute commitment to justice. The game was over, and it was time to see who had really been playing chess. Bradley was waiting for me with a grim expression and a phone in his hand. "Rachel, I've just finished a very interesting conversation with 3 board members. We need to talk about what happens next." As I took a seat across from his desk, I realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of my career, but the future direction of Meridian Financial and everything we had built together over the past decade. Margaret's reign of authoritarian control was about to end, and the collaborative leadership culture that she had tried to destroy was about to rise from the ashes, stronger than ever. The board had made their decision, and justice was finally coming for everyone who had abused their power and underestimated the people they tried to control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.